Hi, welcome back to the channel. As you can see, there's a slightly different look to the Joe Blog studio today. Please let me know what you think. Over the last few days, oil prices have started rising sharply as tensions in the Middle East escalate. And analysts are now warning that if the conflict worsens, oil prices could climb towards $100 per barrel. Now, that would have a huge impact on the global economy, but here's the interesting thing. If oil prices do surge, not every country loses. Some economies would suffer serious damage, but others could actually benefit significantly. So in this video, I want to talk about why the Strait of Hormuz is so important, why oil prices are rising, which countries could be hit the hardest, and which countries could actually come out ahead if oil does reach $100 per barrel. To understand why markets are acting so strongly, we need to look at the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy choke points in the entire world. It's a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman, which connects the Persian Gulf to the global oceans. And every single day, enormous volumes of oil move through this route. Roughly 18 to 20 million barrels of oil pass through the strait every single day. That represents around 20% of global oil consumption. So approximately 1/5 of the world's oil supply depends on ships safely moving through this relatively small stretch of water. And it's not just crude oil. Large volumes of liquefied natural gas from Qatar also pass through this route. So if shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted, even temporarily, the impact on global energy markets could be enormous. That is why this region has always been considered one of the most strategically important locations in the global energy system. And historically, whenever tensions rise here, oil markets react quickly. Following the escalation of the conflict, oil prices jumped as traders reacted to the possibility that global supply could be disrupted. Brent crude rose as markets began pricing in the risk that tanker traffic in the Persian Gulf could become dangerous or restricted. At the moment, prices are still well below the extreme levels seen during previous global energy crises, but analysts are warning that if tensions escalate further, which is probably likely, oil prices could move towards $100 per barrel. And if the Strait of Hormuz were to become seriously disrupted for an extended period, prices could actually rise significantly higher. And at the moment, Iran is saying that it will set on fire any tankers that attempt to pass through the strait because it's moving very close to Iran. Now, global demand for oil remains extremely large, and replacing the supply from the Persian Gulf would be extremely difficult in the short term. So even relatively small disruptions to supply can have a disproportionately large impact on prices. Now, the next question is who would actually suffer the most if oil prices do surge and stay high? And that answer depends on whether a country is an oil importer or an oil exporter. Countries that import large amounts of oil tend to suffer when prices rise. That's because higher energy costs increase inflation and reduce economic growth. But countries that export oil actually benefit because they receive higher revenues. And when you look at the global economy, the biggest oil importers are concentrated in Asia. China is the largest importer of crude oil in the world, importing more than 11 million barrels per day. India is another major importer, and countries like Japan and South Korea rely heavily on imported energy supplies. So if oil prices surge because of disruptions in the Middle East, the economic impact is likely to be felt most strongly in Asia. Higher energy costs would push inflation higher and reduce economic growth in those economies. Bloomberg Economics analysis suggests that large importing economies such as China and India could see a notable hit to GDP growth if oil prices stay high. So Asia could be one of the regions most exposed to global oil shocks. But let's look at what this could mean for the United States. The US, which is the biggest economy in the world, is one of the largest oil producers, thanks to its shale revolution. So the country is much less dependent on imported oil than it used to be. That means the US economy is somewhat insulated from supply disruptions in the Middle East. However, higher global oil prices would still push up gasoline prices for consumers. and fuel prices are a very visible part of the cost of living in the US. So if oil does move towards $100 per barrel, American households would likely see higher fuel costs and transportation costs, and that would push inflation higher, which could complicate the Federal Reserve's efforts to bring inflation back under control and restrict it from cutting interest rates further. Now, looking at Europe, the situation is slightly different. Europe imports a large share of its energy. Although the region has reduced its dependence on Russian oil and gas since the Ukraine war began, it still relies heavily on imported energy. So rising oil prices would push up fuel costs, transport costs, and inflation across Europe. But there is another issue that could be even more important for Europe, and that is natural gas. Since the Ukraine war began, Europe has dramatically reduced imports of pipeline gas from Russia. Instead, many countries have switched to liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which is transported around the world on ships. And that means European electricity prices, which it's producing using the gas, are now much more closely linked to global LNG markets. The problem is that LNG prices have already started rising rapidly as energy markets react to the conflict in the Middle East. And if tensions escalate further, LNG shipments could be disrupted or redirected, and that could push European gas prices significantly higher. So gas plays a major role in electricity generation and heating across Europe. So rising gas prices could increase power costs, industrial costs, and household energy bills, which means Europe could potentially face a double energy shock, higher oil prices and higher natural gas prices at the same time. For the United Kingdom, the impact would likely be felt through higher petrol prices, higher energy bills, and increased inflation, and that could make it more difficult for the Bank of England to continue cutting interest rates. Now, looking at Canada, the situation is quite different. Canada is actually a major oil producer and exporter, so higher oil prices could benefit the Canadian economy through stronger export revenues. Oil sands production in Alberta plays a major role in Canada's energy exports, so rising oil prices could increase government revenues, investment, and export income. However, Canadian consumers would still face higher fuel prices, so the impact is somewhat mixed. Now, looking at Australia, the story is similar. Australia is a major exporter of energy, particularly liquefied natural gas. So higher energy prices can boost export revenues. However, Australian households would still experience higher petrol prices and transportation costs. So again, we've got a mixed impact. But there is another important angle to this story, and that's the potential impact on Russia, because Russia remains one of the largest oil exporters in the world, producing roughly 10 million barrels of oil per day. Western countries have tried to limit Russia's revenues through sanctions and price cap systems on Russian crude exports. However, Russia has continued exporting large volumes of oil, particularly to Asia. Now, one of the biggest buyers of Russian oil has been India. Over the past 2 years, India dramatically increased imports of Russian crude because it was sold at a significant discount. At times, India has been importing around 2 million barrels of oil per day. However, more recently, there were indications that India might reduce those purchases as part of negotiations with the United States over trade tariffs. But that situation may now be changing, because the US Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump's tariffs were illegal, which effectively undermines that agreement. And if that deal collapses, India may have less incentive to limit purchases of Russian oil, which means India could potentially increase imports of Russian crude again, particularly if global prices rise because Russia's offering a discount. There is another factor that could become extremely important if oil prices do surge and stay high, because a very large amount of Russian oil is currently sitting on tankers at sea. Energy tracking data suggests that roughly 140 million barrels of Russian crude are currently stored on vessels, effectively acting as floating storage. Some estimates suggest there may even be 180 million barrels out there. To put that into perspective, 140 million barrels represents roughly 2 weeks of Russia's total oil production. So there's a large volume of oil effectively waiting on the water for buyers. If global oil prices surge because of disruptions in the Middle East and stay high, the price of Russian crude will also rise. Russian oil typically trades at a discount to Brent crude, and those discounts have been quite wide recently. But if it moves broadly in line with global oil prices, so it does move up as general oil prices go up. So if Brent crude rises to $100 per barrel, Russia's export revenues would increase. And with more than 100 million barrels already sitting on tankers, Russia could potentially sell those barrels at much higher prices if there are shortages. If India also returns as a major buyer, that could further boost demand for Russian oil. So while higher oil prices would hurt many importing economies, Russia could actually see a significant increase in energy revenues. Moving on to global economic risks, the broader issue is that rising oil prices feed directly into inflation. Higher energy costs increase transport costs, manufacturing costs, and food prices. That pushes inflation higher across the global economy. And that creates a major challenge for central banks, because over the last 2 years, central banks have been trying to bring inflation back under control. If oil prices surge again, that could delay interest rate cuts and slow economic growth around the world. So the situation we're seeing right now is extremely complex. If the conflict escalates and oil prices continue rising, the global economy could face another energy shock. Large importing economies such as China, India, Japan, and South Korea would likely suffer the biggest economic impacts. Countries like the United States and the United Kingdom would face higher inflation and higher consumer costs. Meanwhile, energy exporters such as Canada, Australia, and Russia could actually benefit from higher prices. And with huge volumes of Russian oil already sitting on tankers, and the possibility that India may resume large-scale purchases, the geopolitical consequences could be significant. Because if oil really does reach $100 per barrel, this won't just be another spike in energy prices, it could reshape the global economic landscape. So thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end. If you have liked what I've said today, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my property or a cash alternative prize, another way of helping to fund the channel. So if you'd like to get involved in that, please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much for that support. I really, really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.